You're frightened of your own death because you identify with that separate little thing, and you think when that turns into something else, you leave. And so it's the fear of death that is the root fear. It's the first chakra fear. And that's the... but fear is always caused by misidentification. What do you want? You want a different kind of answer?
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you've been talking a lot about smoking.
No way you can put me on the
and
spot.
psychedelics. I just wondered what your feelings on those were, on marijuana and LSD. Stuff.
This is like ending my college career on campuses again.
Get kicked out of here too.
Easy come, easy come. I would be remiss if I didn't honor psychedelics for what they did for me. You know, I certainly wouldn't even want to dishonor them. Very profound awakenings for me. Now I see there's other work to do, and I know where I'm going. I just now transforming myself into giving up thinking I'm not there. My guru, when I said to him, should I ever take LSD again? He said, if you're in a cool place and you're feeling much peace and your mind is turning towards God, it could be useful. I heard that. I have taken acid about once every 2 years to remember what I forgot, if I forgot it. Each time I've taken it, it has seemed less relevant than anything in my life. It feels more and more like an anachronism. It feels more and more like we are now living in a culture that allows the mind to do the play without having to chemically get me there. I'm having more support from the environment. Before I didn't have any support from the environment. Now there's a lot of support. I furthermore began to see that the act of taking a joint or taking a hit of acid or taking something is very subtly reinforcing the idea that you're not enough. But it's no more than any other method, than meditating. In other words, all methods are traps. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And the game is to transcend, is to use the trap and then not get trapped by it, by hoping it self-ejects, self-destructs at the other end. Because for a trap to work, you've got to get trapped by it. Otherwise, you don't get trapped by it. Otherwise, it doesn't work. If you keep a nice social distance from it, well, I'll just try meditation, you know. You can't do it. You've got to become a meditator. Then finally, you go beyond that. So I would say that I don't think it's relevant now or necessary, psychedelics. I think under proper conditions, they hold a key to understanding deeper mysteries of human consciousness and relation to spirit. Whether we have the discipline or the systematic way of approaching it to be able to use them in that way, I don't know. In the past, we have been very negligent in our discipline about how the way we do those things. It's like saying Tantra. You say, I'm going to use Tantra. What you really mean is, I want to get laid. And then you call it Tantra, and you think somehow you did some great thing. But as long as there is desire in that system, it isn't Tantra. So it's a very interesting issue about, I mean, there are good ways of using psychedelics. There are good ways in terms of rehabilitation, of shifting people's consciousness. There was research we were doing in prisons of taking people who, where the recidivism rate was 71% of the people were back in jail within a year for doing the same thing all over again. And closing or locking ourselves in rooms with them and all get turning on together with psilocybin. And suddenly, who's the professors and who's the cons, and there's just human beings there. And out of that, they are able to break set of the thing they're locked into and perceive it again. And out of that can come major social change. But what I'm finding is, sorry this is so long-winded, but it's an interesting question, is that as I incorporate into my being these qualities, I can be present with a person. And if my mind doesn't create models, that person is free to fly in that environment as high as they can go. See, what I used to do when I give a lecture of a few thousand people, I'd be in the bathroom smoking a joint before I came out. Because I felt they demand of me the highest consciousness I can get, and I can't get it by myself because I'm too frightened of going out on that stage. So I'll blow my mind a little, then I'll get out there. Can you hear that? The poignancy of that? And finally I decided, since I can't tell them I just did that because it's against the law, there is a hypocrisy in this issue. So we'll change the game. I'll go out and I'll be what I am, and if they don't like it, that'll be the end of that, and I'll become a shoe salesman. And I went out, and it was strange, because some nights I went out and I said to the audience, you know, this was planned 6 months ago. Little knowing there would be a great mini-series on television today. And I really wish I were back in the hotel looking at that, instead of talking to you tonight. That's my truth. What are we going to do with it? And then we started work with it. It's scary to start a lecture that way. People have come for hundreds of miles to hear opera. Yes?
Yeah, you talked a lot about the work that you're doing and not using drugs so that you can continue that work on yourself. I wonder what your greatest discipline or conflict has been and how you've overcome it.
Well, I'll tell you, the word overcome is interesting. If you try to get rid of something, if you try to rip the skin off the snake before it's ready to molt, you get into deep trouble. So that there are things I try to rip away out of ought and should and discipline. And I wasn't very successful at them. And then later they just fell away. So what are obstacles are just interesting statements of where I'm still caught. And if I just sit with it, in time it will fall away. So like there was a time when I was busy, having been a sadhu or renunciate and all that for many years, I was busy feeling like I should have relationship, be in a home environment, that kind of thing. And because I couldn't have it, I felt sad. And I grabbed at it. And then I got it. And then after I quieted down and saw what of that had been the creation of my mind, of my having a model of what I thought I needed to be happy. As I listened, I realized that this was just a model in my mind. This wasn't what was. That what was absolutely beautiful and irrelevant. So there's not consistency, but truth. A new moment. Now at that point, I am once again without partnership or without sense. And I'm just right here. Before I was without partnership, longing for something. Now I'm just here and I'm not. Now, did I get rid of that or change? And I could have gone the other way, by the way. There are a lot of people who are in partnership who long to be on the sadhu renunciate trip. And they go off and they're going against the way of things. And the obvious thing is for them to be back with their wife and their kids or husband and get on with it. Because they're busy being not in a partnership. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that there's a timing in the whole process. And there's no right or wrong in the routine. The only wrong is that to the extent there is any consciousness, you don't intentionally do things which exacerbate suffering in the universe. But to follow that is all the prescriptions for spiritual practice. How not to do that. Am I dealing with?
I guess a while ago I was sitting across the table from you. You were eating at the Black Oak Ranch, and there's a friend of mine who was sitting next to you, and you asked him. This is after we were playing volleyball for a while, and you weren't. You seemed pretty quiet and sort of tired. And you asked him, and you said, "Do you feel that there's too many young deadheads loitering around that go to the shows without tickets, and sort of just go there to be there, to hang out?" He said, "Well, I don't really see a problem with this."
He asked me, or I asked him?
You asked him.
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, I don't really see a problem with people going just to hang out." And you said, I think something like, "Well, that's just because I think that's because you're still young," is what you said to him.
Boy, that's one of those, you know, do you ever have one of those circles where everybody whispers to the next person and it comes back?
I was listening.
I mean, I don't even recognize any of that conversation.
Yeah.
Well, I'm brain damaged anyway, but I mean, I really don't know. I mean, I don't recognize it.
Yeah, it was at the same.
Yeah.
But you told him he was too young to understand.
Well, too young to understand means, and that's an interesting question, if that's the question.
Yeah.
I mean, too young to understand means that you have an agenda. See, the predicament is that in the sequence of events of an incarnation, you've got to become somebody before you can become nobody. If you try to short-circuit it too much, you end up in nowhere land. And there are a lot of 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds who are kind of floating around. They don't have any, they lost their zip code. And there were periods when, in the first times of my spiritual work, where I was trying to say to everybody, come on, get high, let's go, let's get out here, let's see it's all one, see the love, see the beauty, the truth. And then I began to look around, and you know, you look at an audience, and everybody was kind of floating around on welfare, and you said, come on, get your act together, you learn your zip code, get a job, for God's sake. It's very far out. You look at an audience, and half of them are on their way out, and half of them need to come back, until finally you get both of them all together. And so sometimes some of the stuff you'd say to somebody isn't really appropriate for somebody at a certain stage, because they're passing you in the night, going in the other direction.
Yeah, he really stayed quiet. He didn't know what to say, because he really didn't feel anything wrong with people just hanging out at shows. And he said that's
I don't
because
see anything wrong with people hanging out at shows. I hang out at their shows.
I think you asked him if he noticed that there were more people hanging out than actually going into the concert.
Oh.
And,
Oh, that's because there's been a real interesting moral dilemma for the dead. Because as they get bigger, it's harsher for the deadheads. And the deadheads have been part of the family. And it's like, what do you do with your family as the game gets... It's like, I built a slideshow about compassion and suffering. And I've been working on it, about the American dream. And I was planning to take it on the road next April when I tour. I usually tour for about two and a half months. I do a city every other night. So I decided to take the slideshow with me. It's a 3-projector, 800-slide show. That was just a thought I had, and everybody said, great, wonderful. Then I started to deal with what kind of equipment I need to do that for large halls. Then I started to deal with the technicians I would need to run the equipment I would need to show this thing in large halls. Then I started to deal with the union labor I would have to hire to sit there while I had my technicians come in to do this show. I mean, the screen itself is 22 feet long, much bigger than this one, and you've got to wrap it up after every show, and then unwrap it, put it in the truck. It's going to cost $150,000 to take the show on the road. Because once you get up to a certain size, you're dealing with unions and all kinds of problems in logistics and rental of huge equipment and the whole thing. And it all turns into big business. And at that point, some of the fun goes out of it. And that's the issue about the Grateful Dead Deadheads love affair. What happens to that love affair, you know, when the scene gets that big? And I think that's a cause of concern to a lot of people in the hog farm who act as, you know, out there to keep things cool out in the yard and stuff. That's where it's all coming from.
I love the dead, but I forget too about talking about them.
You what?
I love the dead, but if we get too involved talking about just the dead. I have a question about something you said earlier.
Well, don't take it just about the dead.
No, I know.
Take it in the generic sense about bigness. This is the same issue for all of us. Can you do that?
Well, yes,
What you
we've
perceive in
talked
your
about
question?
drugs. That
Yes.
is part of my question. We talked about drugs, and you mentioned that there were ills in the 60s that caused the downfall of the movement, so to
Yes.
speak. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the dangers.
Dangers of drugs or
Or
the dangers of the ills
whole
that...
thing that happened, and whether drugs were a part
I
of it.
think what happened was a kind of a messianic idealism that was not rooted in, that was not tested, didn't come out of the depth of being. It came out of having touched a possibility. And then everybody got a little ahead of themselves. They started to take their Western mind and use it to make hay of this thing that they had touched. They honored it properly. And so some took it into political action, but they took it in with anger. And some took it into spiritual work, but they did it as a way of achieving enlightenment, all those kinds of things. And I think that the ways in which we try to set up alternative social institutions like communes and economic systems and all that, ecologically more conscious, there was a lot of city people trying to live on the farm and being very naive about it. And Steve Gaskin dealt with all that with his farm, and there was a lot of attempt to get straight behind all this stuff. But what it was, it had a revolutionary quality in it, not an evolutionary quality. The result was that it was fighting against something. And it didn't form a relationship of true compassion and love with the establishment. Finally, it had to be rejected. Is that feeling straight?
Yes.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about touring and going all over the world, and it seems to me that requires a lot of money. And I was wondering if you had any ethical problems in your head with where your money comes from to do what you do.
Well, when I go out and give a lecture, like I will do next spring, I will rent a hall and I'll do promotion, and then I'll travel there, and I'll sleep in a hotel, and I will go to the lecture. The people that come to the lecture will pay $10. That $10, about 4 or 5 of it, probably half of it, goes to the hiring of the hall and the rental of the sound system and the promotion and getting me there. So in that sense, everybody chipped in to make that happen. Then about $1 of that, $10, goes to me to keep me fed and alive. And then the other $4 goes to Save Foundation, which then uses it in Guatemala and Nepal and so on. So I think it's a contract that I feel reasonably comfortable about. I don't amass money. And it feels to me that if people didn't feel it was useful for them to come and hear me, they wouldn't buy a ticket. So I don't feel I'm ripping off the scene. See, we deal in the spiritual community with the concept of dana. Because when I went to my guru in India, he never took a nickel from me. He wouldn't take any money. But the result was, the difference was he was living in a culture where everybody accepts responsibility for supporting this kind of stuff. Well, in our culture, they don't. The question is, can you then justify charging for something when you were given it free? And then you've got to be responsible for how you use the money. And it's got to be public accounting. That's why I'm answering the question in detail. Is that question all right? Am I not dealing with your question?
Yeah, and I was also wondering where the funds came from when you were traveling before. You said like, because I'm
They come out of the dollar. Okay.
What do you say leads you by in terms of doing? And has your diet evolved over a period of time? Did you go through phases a vegetarian, eating?
My diet has been all over the lot in the last 30 years. I mean, there was a time when I was a real, what in Yiddish you would call a verbrennte macrobiotic. I mean, I would no more eat something that wasn't macrobiotic, that George Osawa didn't pass on. Then, and I was, you know, I remember Time magazine interviewing me about it, and I said, well, it gets you high. I mean, I was being my psychedelic self even then. What I've been for many years is what is that I don't eat red meat. And then John Robbins wrote a book around here, and that made me want to stop eating chicken. So I was left with seafood. But then the Dalai Lama said the other day that if you're going to eat other beings, eat a big one, because then so many lives don't go. So instead of little shrimp, eat a big cow, because the more people get off on one cow, it's just one awareness. That's a funny one to work with. I mean, I don't know where I'm at now. So I feel like last night I had a guy named Jerry Needleman over for dinner at Yale, and Jerry's a professor at San Francisco State. And I made a eggplant parmesan. And I was like thinking, all right, this is the way I'm going to do it. I'm just going to turn into doing violence to vegetables. Somebody's got to get it. And I can go in any direction. I've been with the American Indians, and we've had feasts in which we eat meat because they thank the animal for giving its life. And I've eaten in vegetarian places that feel that they do great violence to the food and do it without love. To me, food cooked with love and with honoring and with an appreciation of the way in which it's the one feeding the one is extraordinarily beautiful and makes it all sacred. And when it's sacred, who cares who lives and who dies? That's what grokking is about. And at the same moment, I can hear that. I still don't want to eat red meat because it gives me my bacteria don't handle it well. I mean, suddenly my shit stinks, and suddenly I feel heavy. So I don't want to eat meat. That's the best I can do. And I cut down on dairy because of cholesterol. I mean, I'm not really, I'm not a good yogi in that sense at all. I could be very happy. I mean, I'm happy in countries where I eat the same thing every day, rice and dal and vegetable. But Indian diet is horrible. It's all white sugar and grease, I mean, it's just incredible. And that's what my guru used to keep pushing in my face. Grease and white sugar. Yes.
I had a question about your involvement with SEBA. And it's based on, I've seen with a lot of sort of aid programs helping other cultures in other countries that they can be very good intentioned and do everything they intended and still have, just a horrible, harmful effect. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, you've been talking about compassion and suffering.
Yeah, I think that I'll give you two examples of that. We are very, very conscious about that issue. We're working on it all the time to understand. It's almost impossible to know whether you're really creating suffering in the full sense of it until you're fully enlightened. You just don't know the subtle ways in which you're doing it. But part of it, you can see the obvious ways of taking away people's power or a sense of self or something like that. Like in our Nepal project, which is it's about a $500,000 project a year, and it involves hospitals and clinics and 300 ophthalmic assistants and surgeons and surgical camps and all kinds of stuff. That whole project, there is only one Westerner in Nepal. That's all Nepali. In other words, part of us is to give what we can give, but allow the people there to decide what they need. We got no problem there about wanting to bring people for eye surgery, except some people don't want to see. And do you decide what's good for people or not? That's one of the issues. Then we've got an issue in Guatemala that's real interesting. Here's a good example. We are supporting 3 refugee camps in Chiapas of Guatemalans, refugees. I went down there, and these people are living, they are like slaves to the Mexican labor force. And they work in the cane fields in killer conditions. And they come back, the men come back, and there's one hose in the whole camp for all of the water for the entire camp, let's say 150 people. So the men come back black because they light fires in the cane fields. And then before they're finished smoking, they go in and cut them down. They all have kidney problems from cutting with machetes all day. And they are come back black, and they wash in front of the thing. So the women, there's no time for the women to wash at all. I mean, these are the conditions. They're living in mud buildings, tin buildings with mud floors where the cane fields are above them. So when it rains, when the rainy season starts, the water drips down, and they live there with their babies in about this much mud in the kitchen and the bedroom. Can you imagine that? These are refugee camps. And so I come in, and I mean, how do I feel? I mean, what am I going to do? Okay, look, so you say, what can we do for you? They say, we want cement floors, we want this, we need this, our children are starving to death, we need breakfast, so on. You need those things, we will help you get them. Set up tool banks so they borrow the tools and they rent them for like a half a penny, and then the money buys another tool, and all those kinds of things. They organize in order to figure out how to do all these things, because these all came from different parts of Guatemala, so they're not a natural village. They're going to create an artificial village. They create an administrator, and they get strong, and they get really effective. So they're educating their kids, they're feeding their kids. They got cement floors. It looks like a happy story, doesn't it? The only problem is that they all want to go back to Guatemala. And the reason they'll never be able to go back to Guatemala is because they are so strong and organized that if they go back now, they get killed. So in a way, we have set them up to be murdered if they live out the thing they want. Can you hear all that? I mean, where do you move? Do you get frozen in inability to move? Or do you talk with everybody and listen as carefully as you can? And then you do the best you can, and you keep trying to keep each other straight, and you feed it back as well as you can, and you try to straighten up a little more. Is that deal with your question? Yeah.
Do you think that the quote-unquote drug culture of the 60s has had negative repercussions on my generation? Meaning, when you and my parents were taking LSD and smoking a lot of marijuana, you were already grown.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
I do not suggest that when you're busy becoming somebody, you screw around too much with trying to be nobody too soon. I think it's it's very confusing, and I don't think it's wise. And I think that what happened in the 60s opened the door for a lot of things, of people feeling empowered in certain ways, in terms of sexual freedoms, in terms of freedom to do freedom to go about the business of seeking their own gratification. And my sense is that that as much as I would like not to have believed it, that for people that were seeking pleasure and avoidance of encounters in life, because it was too much to deal with reality of suffering, marijuana, alcohol did lead to marijuana, marijuana did lead to psychedelics, and psychedelics did lead to cocaine, and cocaine did lead in some cases to heroin, and did lead in some cases to crack. Crack will lead to ice, and so on. So in that sense, I think that the use of chemicals which are basically not used by people, and they would not be the chemical of choice for people that want to open their consciousness to be with what is, but they want to push away a plane, that there was license for using chemicals in the culture. that came out. That would be the negative side of it. Okay. And you know, it's hard to weigh the negativities of a technological breakthrough. You know, like you take the automobile, my God.